Welcome Welcome everyone to today's lecture. Today we are finishing up the section of the class, and in fact the whole course, with Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. This is one of my very favorite articles to teach, in person at least. We'll see how I like it in this format. But this is one that often my students are very interested in and very fired up about, and it's one that deeply resonates with me as well. Before we get into this is going to be a whole narrative here, so it's going to be maybe a bit of a long one, right? But before we get into this, I just want to make a little warn everybody that the conversation that's happening in this article is happening in the early 1960s. Back then, the terms Negro and colored, when referring to African Americans, were considered neutral terms. They weren't considered slurs or near slurs or offensive the way that they are today. So for these purposes, for discussing King, we are going to take those to be neutral terms. So anyway, so this one requires a little more historical context than some of our other articles, because King is really plugging himself and his organization and the movement into history. That's one of the things that he's taking very seriously and trying very hard to do with in this article, is try to show where he fits in the long tide of history, generally, and specifically with regard to political reformers in the Christian church. So who was King? Who was Martin Luther King? I would say at this point in class, and leave that question hang out there for a second, and eventually someone tired of the awkward silence would raise his or her hand and say, well, a civil rights leader. Right. And then me being a philosopher, I would say, yes, what does that mean? Right. So I'll spare you the ceremony. King was in fact a civil rights leader, certainly the most important civil rights leader of the 20th century. What does it mean to be interested in civil rights? Well, civil rights, the term civil rights maps very well onto the idea we have of human rights, maybe even of natural rights. So we're talking about civil rights. We're talking about the sort of intersection of your human rights and the kinds of rights that the government has a duty to protect with the laws, right? So when we're talking about civil rights, we're talking about human rights, human and natural rights, but we're also talking about human and natural rights in terms of the government needs to defend these basic sorts of rights in the law. And if the government isn't defending these kinds of basic rights in the law, then the government is doing something seriously wrong, right? So, okay. So King, brief history of segregation in the South. So after the U.S. Civil War brings an end to slavery, or at least the version of slavery that had been practiced up until that point, back in 1865. There's a Reconstruction period on the South. The South is a mess, right? Economically, socially, in every way you can imagine, right? So, slavery, explicit slavery, is illegal, but the various white institutions in the South, that doesn't mean that they're going to immediately have black people be equal to them, obviously, and so the white institutions in the South immediately begin to invent all sorts of ways to distinguish between the good white person and the black person who needs to stay where black people live, right? And not be around us, right? We can't hold you as slaves anymore. That doesn't mean you're one of us, so get away from us, right? Is the attitude, right? So this is enforced in various ways. There are legal ways of doing this, and there are, sort of cultural ways, informal ways, you might say, of enforcing these rules. Right? The legal ways include laws like segregation. Segregation are laws that say, well, look, there are going to be white schools and black schools. There are going to be white shopping malls and black shopping malls. There are going to be white restaurants and black restaurants. White people eat at white restaurants and work at white restaurants, and black people work and eat at black restaurants and elsewhere, right? And it's in the law. If you are a black person who decides that you would like to have a sandwich at a white counter, first of all, you're likely to be told to leave. And if you don't, you can come in and be arrested, right? Which leads to, as I said before, the informal ways these laws are enforced is, oh yeah, you're probably not going to be asked to leave. You're probably going to be beaten up by some white person who didn't expect to see a black person there that day, and doesn't take kindly to that, right? And God forbid that it comes to, in this era, the police actually arriving, because then the police are going to join in on beating you up, and you're going to be lucky. You probably, if you're a black person who's explicitly going against segregation in the early 19th century, you're probably not going to live through the encounter, right? And there are some very famous examples of this, of people explicitly and kind of accidentally violating the norms of segregation in the South, and the worst imaginable things happening to them. The most famous case being Emmett Till, probably in the 1950s. He was a teenager who was visiting from the North, where he was used to racism, but not the strict codes of racism that were enforced in Mississippi or Alabama? I don't know. Anyway, he was visiting a cousin in the South, somewhere, either Mississippi or Alabama. And he famously, the story goes, nobody's really quite sure what the lead up was, but he did something as innocuous as, commenting on or whistling at a white girl at a local store, right? And the girl's boyfriend and brother-in-law, I don't know, some group representing the lady's interests, showed up that evening. They abducted a 14-year-old Emmett Till in the middle of the night and beat him up and threw him in the river, right? This made national headline. Now, this was not a big deal, or, well, this was not yet news, right? This stuff happened all the time in the South. The only thing that made this any different is that Emmett Till's mother made such a fuss about it, right? And Ebony magazine ended up printing pictures of Emmett Till's open casket funeral, right? Where this beautiful 14-year-old boy is turned into, he's just beaten all to hell, right? And this shocks this is one thing that in the civil rights era really begins to shock the conscience of the U.S., of the United States. Not just the black conscience, but the white conscience too. It's causing white people to take notice that, oh my God, that's horrible, right? Not here, not in the United States. We think better, we should do better, right? The next step in this story is 1955-ish, is the famously Rosa Parks, a seamstress in wing issues. Hang on. Anyway, technical issues resolved. Rosa Parks, a seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, decides one day she is too tired to give up her seat on the bus. Part of segregation was if you were on a crowded bus, and the white people could, if you were a black person on a crowded bus, first of all, you had to sit in the back, and if there was spillover and you were sitting out of the black section, even if you weren't, if a white person decided, hey, I want your seat, up you go, right? So Rosa Parks decided one day, you know what, my feet are tired, forget it, I'm not getting up, right? So the police are called, and it's a whole big to-do leading to the Montgomery bus boycott, right? Black people decide decided to demonstrate, and in allegiance with and in support of Rosa Parks, they decide that they are not going to take the bus anymore, right? And this brings the bus system in Montgomery to its feet, right? And so the Montgomery bus system then has to change its policy, right? Now, this really kicks something off, right? This shows people that this isn't a hopeless fight, right? And it shows people that you can do this. You can get people to change these laws without throwing bricks, without burning anything down, without punching people in the face. You just have to hit people. I mean, this is America after all. You just have to hit people in their wallets. Right? If you can just cut off the purse strings, you can get all of this stuff done without anybody getting a black eye, right? Without one person getting their teeth kicked in or set on fire, right? This is a powerful idea. It has a long history. It has history going back further to a decade earlier in India. Gandhi had used nonviolent tactics to get the British to decolonize. We're familiar with that term from the K section, remember? Yes, the Indians had gotten the Brits to just get out, go away, by using these sorts of nonviolent tactics, just by not allowing them to tell them what to do, right? Also has its history going back to writers like Henry David Thoreau, an American philosopher, and going back, of course, also to Jesus Christ, if we want to take it back that far. So, anyway, in 1957, inspired by all of this, Dr. Martin Luther King comes on the scene. He's a young minister, and he interested in a lot of these issues, in segregation and in civil rights, and he meets with a group of other like-minded religious leaders. They call themselves the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they form in 1957 and appoint young Dr. Martin Luther King as their head, right? And their explicit purpose is to do what they can to bring an end to segregation in the South. And not just are their goals important, but their tactics are going to be important too. The most important, in fact. They are going to bring an end to segregation through nonviolent tactics, right? So, okay. Let's take a look at the notes. So, segregation were policies of racial separation in the South from after the Civil War until 1964. The Civil Rights Act in 1964, just about a little over a year after the events of today's lecture, the body of today's lecture, the Civil Rights Act is officially going to bring an end to segregation. So, spoiler alert if you're taking this as sort of a narrative. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, was established in 1957. It consists of church leaders led by King and segregation. So it's interested in civil rights issues generally, but particularly interested in segregation. And they are as famous for their tactics as their goals. They are going to end segregation, and they in fact did end segregation through what's called nonviolent direct action. So let's talk about nonviolent direct action. Okay, now let's talk about two kinds of political action, right? Two kinds of ways that you might go out if you see something wrong going on in your community, that you're going to go out and you're going to try to change that thing, right? You're change that practice, confront a person, etc., right? So we can think of, historically, there are two kinds of political action. There is indirect, that is using someone else to confront injustice. Typically, this is some kind of lawmaker, right? You see something you don't like, something going on, you call your congressman, and you demand that your congressman introduce a bill to try to change something, right? Or you call your your local mayor or alderman, and you want to introduce some kind of ordinance or enforce some kind of ordinance to stop something bad that you see is going on, right? Now, that can work, but it takes a while, right? So for various reasons, and also, as we will see, sometimes the law is wrong. Sometimes your congressman says, well, he's not breaking the law, so I'm not going to enforce it, right? Or your alderman says nobody's breaking the law, right? So what are your options then if nobody's willing to enforce the law, or if the law itself is wrong? Well, your option then might be what's called direct action. Direct action is going out into the community to confront injustice yourself. You see something you don't like, and you go out and you are going to confront that injustice yourself, right? Now, direct action historically comes in two flavors, as you might imagine. If you see something happening that you don't like, and you go out to confront somebody, as you might imagine, sometimes that gets violent. Sometimes it's meant to be violent in the form of things like we have a cat situation here. Yes, could you think about it? My cat Otis is engaging in some nonviolent direct action right now. He's sitting in, right? Direct action might be violent. It might take the form of assassinations or terrorism or something like that. On a smaller scale, it might mean, if you don't like how somebody is running their business, you burn the gas station down, right? So any of these are considered non-violent, or these are all considered violent actions, right? And King, it should be noted, from King's perspective, when he talked about violence, he wasn't just talking about violence against people. He also was talking about violence against property. He didn't think that burning things down and breaking things was within what he was promoting, right? So nonviolent direct action, however, consists of things like boycotts and peaceful protests. So instead of, if you see a gas station doing something that you don't like, instead of killing the owner or burning the place down, you organize a boycott. You just get everybody together and you say, hey, we are going to boycott the gas station, right? This leads to the concept of nonviolent direct action. Just sort of putting all this together. Nonviolent direct action is confronting injustice directly, but through nonviolent means. So we're going to go out in the community. We're not going to worry about just calling our congressman. We are going to go out in the community, and we are going to engage in these kind of sit-ins and protests and boycotts and so on, right? To get people to stop doing what they're doing, right? And these are the tactics that King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference are going to employ against the institution of segregation, right? King then goes on to explain that nonviolent direct action is nothing that you enter into lightly, particularly not in places like Birmingham, right? Because you might be nonviolent, but that doesn't mean the people who are confronting you are going to be nonviolent. That doesn't mean the police are going to be nonviolent, not by any means. You're going to get your teeth kicked in, right? You're going to get pepper sprayed. You're going to be bitten by police dogs. You're going to get socked in the eye by angry white locals, right? So King thinks we need to understand, before we take a bite of the sandwich, we need to understand the mustard that's on it, right? So he thinks that this is not something to just be, okay, tomorrow we're going to go out and we're going to sit in front of these segregation, these whites only signs. This is something that we need to take very, very seriously, and we need to prepare ourselves for, right? So he spells out the 4 elements of a nonviolent campaign, and we will talk about that next. Okay, next, King talks about the 4 elements of a nonviolent campaign, the 4 elements of nonviolent direct action. He says, in the first case, you need to collect your facts. You need to make sure that you have your stuff together, right? You need to make sure that injustice exists. You go out, you do your research, and you say, okay, well, yes, this person, these people are doing this bad thing that we don't like, and these people have not responded to requests from the community to change this, right? That leads into the next step, which is negotiation. You go out and you ask the person who is performing the injustice, you should stop doing that, right? So take specifically the example that King is worried about with segregation, right? There's a restaurant that has a whites only sign, right? We decide that we don't like segregation. We go to the white owner and we say, hey, we would like to take that sign down and begin to serve black customers. The white owner refuses, right? At the larger level, you might try to negotiate with the city council. You might say, hey, you need to take down these segregation statutes and these segregation ordinances. And if you don't, we're going to make life unpleasant here. We're going to do what we can to bring about change, right? Now, if negotiations don't work, as they don't most places in the South, the next step that King advises is a cleansing period, right? This is a period where they go through various kinds of workshops where they talk about their goals and they talk about what they role play. They talk about what kind of resistance they're going to meet. They prepare themselves physically and spiritually for what is about to happen to them. Specifically, they prepare themselves to take abuse, verbal, emotional, physical, take abuse without responding, right? They have to be able to take a punch without hitting back, right? Then once they have done that, once they think they are to that point, they go out in the community and they perform direct action, right? They go out and they confront the white business owners with a boycott and with a sit-in. They go out and they occupy the public space right out in front of the restaurant with various kinds of signs, maybe sing some songs, give some speeches, and generally call attention to the fact that they are angry with what's going on there in the community, right? So now, oh, by the way, the movie that came out a few years ago called Selma, which is about Martin Luther King, does a really, really good job, among other things, of representing these workshops, these cleansing workshops, where they prepare themselves to confront injustice, right? They prepare themselves physically and spiritually for this process, right? Now, what is this supposed to do? I mean, let me tell you how the story is going to go. We decide we want the signs to be taken down from this restaurant. The white restaurant owner tells us where we can go. The city council also tells us where we can go. So we spend some time, in a church basement, role playing, confronting each other, getting ready for this process, and then we go out and we sit in front of this restaurant. Well, guess what? The role playing was not for nothing. Sure enough, we are confronted with abuse, verbal and then physical, by various white people. The restaurant owner, up to and not limited to the restaurant owner himself. Then they call the police. The police show up with dogs and with tear gas, and they kick us and they hit us and they throw us in the paddy wagon. And they cart us off to jail. The next day, we're in jail, all bloody and bruised. The whites only sign are still in front of the restaurant. So, thanks, Dr. King. Right, now I have fewer teeth than I had before, but there are just as many whites only signs. So what is the point of this supposed to do? How is this supposed to work exactly? Well, it's important to understand that King is he's a master of the manipulation of the media, and he is counting on the media being an important part of this, because the image that he wants on American eyeballs is he wants the image of peaceful protesters sitting out in front of these restaurants, holding signs, making the very reasonable demand that these whites-only signs come down. Peaceful protesters being met with all of this very violent verbal and physical abuse, both from the citizens and then especially from the police. When the police show up, they begin immediately hitting people in the head with clubs, throwing them in the back of the paddy wagon and carting off, right? So the idea here is that the protests begin on Monday. And let's say King is sure that he can bring to bear total in these protests. He can bring 10,000 people into a town, right? Well, what he does is he begins up. 10,000 is too much. Say that in total he can bring maybe 2,000 people into a protest. So what he does is on the first day he deploys 200 people to sit in front of this restaurant, right? They get beaten up, they get kicked around, they get thrown out, right? Well, the next day he brings in another 200, right? And the idea is that as he slowly as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference begin to slowly show that they can bring more and more people in, the images that are shown around the nation begin to stir the conscience of the community, and people begin to say, you know what, I'm going to go join those protests. So all the kicking and screaming and the teeth get knocked out, rather than beginning to calm the protests, by day 4 or 5, we've gone from 200 protesters to 1,000 protesters, right? And this is, and the people in the town don't know what to make of this. These protests started out small, but now they've grown, right? And now we've got national and international eyes on how our police officers are coming in and they are cracking the skulls of nonviolent protesters. It makes our city look really bad, and only more people are pouring in to take the sides of the protesters, right? So this is the process working, right? This King says that the purpose of these protests are to bring about a situation that is so crisis-packed that the leaders have no alternative but to negotiate, right? We tried to negotiate before this process went into place. They refused to negotiate. Well, now we are going to use these tactics to bring them back to the negotiating table, because they don't know when this is going to end. They don't know how many protesters we're going to be able to bring in here, and nothing is going to get done until these protests are called off, right? That the city is only going to look worse and worse and worse, and we're only going to bring more and more protesters in, and more, they're going to be the civil services of the city, the police are going to be working full-time to be filling paddy wagons with more and more protesters that come in. They're not going to be able to get anything done, right? Now, okay, so let's look at the notes from that. So, okay, so nonviolent direct action has 4 steps. First of all, there is the collection of facts. You see if injustice is present in the community. There is negotiation. You call on business owners and city leaders to bring an end to the injustice. When they refuse, you go through a cleansing process where you engage in different kinds of workshops to prepare yourself for what you're about to experience. You're about to be kicked in the head. You're about to be spit on. Can you take that abuse without throwing a punch back, right? And then you go out and you engage in direct action. You go out and you take it to the streets. You sit out in front of the business. You engage in, you have a sit-in, call for boycotts, raise signs, and so on, right? The purpose of this, as King says, is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. Okay, so that's how the process is supposed to work. How well did it actually work? Hang on, I'm back. So that's how the process is supposed to work. How well did it actually work? Well, it had worked really, really well in Montgomery with the whole Rosa Parks situation, right? People like King and Hugo Black and Ralph Abernathy or Fred Abernathy, one of those Abernathy, had risen out of had come to call in that situation and used a lot of these tactics very, very successfully. They won. The bus system ended up desegregating, right? That stands in contrast to a similar boycott they tried to raise in Albany a few years later. I believe that was they tried to end segregation. I believe by specifically arranging a strike of trash workers, right? That was in Albany, Georgia, a few years later, and about 61, right? And they had run into some problems. Specifically, they had run into the problem of the local police chief. Local police chief in Albany was Laurie Pritchett, a man, not a woman, not Laurie like a girl, right? But Laurie Pritchett had learned his lesson from some of King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's successes over the past few years. And Pritchett explained to all of his police officers very carefully he doesn't want to see anybody cracking any skulls or stepping on any necks or anything bad. Be as polite as you can as you arrest these protesters, right? And that's what they did, and that kind of beat King's, that kind of defeated King's strategy, right? Now, King then decides, well, hey, I can't let this happen again. So what I need to do is I need to take the fight to the ugliest, most racist place that we can think of. Some place where we're not going to be outfoxed by somebody who just tells the local police, oh, well, just be nice to the protesters. As long as there's a TV camera on you, don't crack any skulls, right? We need to take it to the skull-cracking capital of the United States, right? Where we're guaranteed to get a rise out of people. Welcome to Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, right? Birmingham, Alabama had a wide reputation as being the most violently racist place in the United States. It was the sort of crown jewel of segregation and Southern racism. It earned the nickname Bombingham because of how many bombs had gone off in affluent black neighborhoods and in neighborhoods that had tried to desegregate, right, where black people and white people had begun to live together, right? The Ku Klux Klan obviously is very involved in day-to-day life in Birmingham. And it is wildly, violently segregated, right? So King says, that's where I need to be. I'm going to take the fight to him. I'm going to go right in there, right? And so King gets the wild idea of desegregating the most violently segregated place in the country, right? So this brings us to the Birmingham campaign. How do we do this? Well, by this time, King has his reputation precedes him, and cities are very nervous. Particularly the city leaders in Birmingham are very nervous about the mess that this threatens to cause, right? To maximize his punches, metaphoric punches, of course, not literal punches, to maximize his economic punch, King realizes that the best time to do these kinds of make this kind of disruption is obviously going to be during a shopping season, right? So he says, okay, Christmas 1962, Birmingham, here we come. So you better start negotiating with us. That's step number 2. There's no doubt that injustice exists here, so you better negotiate with us. Well, 1962 in Birmingham is an election year. There is an election for mayor, and the election in November is not decisive. It goes into a runoff, right? You have 2 options, as you tend to do in your election for mayor. You have the head of public safety in Birmingham. That is the head of both the police and the fire department. And that is a man named Bull Connor, whose name might be familiar to you. He has earned the reputation as being somebody as Skullcracker number 1, right? He is not taking anybody's business. He's an ardent defender of segregation. He openly has ties to the Ku Klux Klan, and he is in charge of all the police, right? And he wants to be mayor, right? On the other hand, there is another segregationist who is the less offensive alternative to King and his people, Alfred Boutwell, right? Who is still a segregationist, but nonetheless is going to be, there's a real opportunity here, though, for Birmingham to hear the ring of the bell and to go for the lesser of 2 evils, right? So the city council puts King off. They say, okay, hey, hang on, we're in the midst of a runoff election. Don't come during the Christmas season. That's not going to give us some time, right? Well, the runoff election goes into 1963, and sure enough, Birmingham chooses Bull Connor to be as their selection, right? So, okay, real-time fact check. Connor actually lost the mayoral election of 1962. Nonetheless, that left a segregationist still in place. Boutwell, whenever he came into office, wasn't going to negotiate. The newly minted mayor was not going to negotiate with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? So King has lost his opportunity at Christmas. The next opportunity, shopping season opportunity, is Easter in 1963. And this brings us to the very famous Birmingham campaign of 1963. The strategy plays out. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference comes into Birmingham. They begin to they target local businesses during the second busiest shopping season of the year. They have a lot of protesters. They have a lot of signs. And Bull Connor, though he lost the mayoral election, is still head of public safety, in charge of the police. And he does his thing. He shows up and the police force begins to show up and crack skulls in front of TV cameras and throw people into the paddy wagon, take them off to jail, right? So within a few days, this is causing chaos in Birmingham, right? In the midst of this, King himself is arrested, is thrown into jail. In the midst of this, King's lawyer brings into him a letter that has appeared in the paper, right? In the midst of all of this chaos going on, there is published in the local newspaper what is called the Call for Unity from a list of local clergy leaders, right? A list of local reverends and church leaders. And the Call for Unity, in summation, says that condemns King's protests, right? It's a short statement. I will read it in its entirety now because King's letter from Birmingham jail answers a lot of the charges made in this Call for Unity point by point. He kind of uses this as an outline for his letter. So the Call for Unity, April 12th, 1963, that's Good Friday. We, the undersigned clergymen, are among those who, in January, issued an appeal for law and order and common sense in dealing with racial problems in Alabama. We expressed understanding that honest conviction in racial matters could be properly pursued in the courts, but urged that decisions of those courts should be, in the meantime, peacefully obeyed. Since that time, there has been some evidence of increased forbearance and a willingness to face facts. Responsible citizens have undertaken to work on various problems which cause racial friction and unrest. In Birmingham, recent public events have given indication that we all have opportunity for a new, constructive, and realistic approach to racial problems. Sounds pretty encouraging. However, we are now confronted by a series of demonstrations by some of our Negro citizens, directed and led in part by outsiders. We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel their hopes being slow in being realized. We are convinced that these demonstrations are untimely and unwise. We agree rather with certain local Negro leadership, which has called for an open and honest negotiation of racial issues in our area. And we believe that this kind of facing of issues can be accomplished by citizens of our own metropolitan area, white and Negro, meeting with knowledge and experience of the local situation. All of us need to face that responsibility and find proper channels for its accomplishment. Just as we formerly pointed out that hatred and violence have no sanction in our religious and political traditions, we also point out that such actions as incite to hatred and violence, however technically peaceful those actions may be, have not contributed to the resolution of our local problems. We do not believe that these days of new hope are days when extreme measures are justified in Birmingham. We commend the community as a whole and the local media and law enforcement in particular on the calm manner in which these demonstrations have been handled. We urged the public to continue to show restraint should the demonstrations continue and the law enforcement official to remain calm and continue to protect our city from violence. We further strongly urge our own Negro community to withdraw support from these demonstrations and to unite locally in working peacefully for a better Birmingham. When rights are consistently denied, a cause should be pressed in our court and in negotiations among local leaders, not in the streets. We appeal to both our white and Negro citizenry to observe the principles of law and order and common sense. And then it's signed by the list of local religious leaders, right? Now, reading this, King's not shocked, right? But you might say he's a little disappointed, right? And what he's going to do is he is going to take this opportunity to explain himself to some of his brothers in the cloth, right? And in short, he is going to explain to them why they're on the wrong side of history. He's do it in a very patient, brotherly way, but in a way that is going to decisively pin them on the wrong side of history. And this letter is a good representation of perhaps well-meaning people being on the wrong side of history. I mean, this letter is doomed for all time to be read in shrinking contrast to the soaring rhetoric of King's letter from a Birmingham jail and the knowledge of what comes out of the Birmingham campaign. So let's get to that. King, now after all this context, let's get to King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Okay, so King takes this opportunity to compose what comes to be the letter from Birmingham jail. And again, he takes the call for unity kind of almost point by point, and talks about things that he wants to address, right? In the first case, he wants to answer this charge that these protests are being directed and led by outsiders. That the implication being that King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference are these uninvited people from elsewhere who are coming in to stir up trouble in Alabama or in Birmingham, right? And a few years ago, after the Michael Brown protests, some of these same kinds of charges were made against some civil rights leaders, right? The idea being the same, that St. Louis has problems, but our problems are our problems, and the last thing we need is somebody else from some far-flung land coming in here and telling us that how to do our business and how to take care of our problems, and stirring up even more trouble, using this as an opportunity for a photo op, right, and for your own personal glory. And then afterwards, I suppose, you then go off and leave us back here to continue to struggle with these problems. So thanks, but no thanks, right? So same idea here is being demonstrated by the authors of the Call for Unity. They're in effect saying, well, King, this is our business and our problem, and we will solve it on our own terms, and we're doing that. We're taking the actions necessary. So, okay. So first of all, buzz off. You're an outsider. King's response to this is quite famous. Maybe it results in the most famous line from the letter. In the first case, he says, "Well, now wait a second. I'm not from Alabama, but I was invited here. Right? It was actually local leaders in Birmingham who asked the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to come and take part in these protests." Right? But also, King says, we are all part of the same destiny. We are all part of the same human fabric, right? And he says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That's the most famous line from this letter. Meaning that we can't sit in one place and pretend that that what happens in that place doesn't have an effect on some other part of our society. It is my business, in effect, King is saying, that there is injustice happening in my community, in my nation. Now, at this point, I really like asking my students, now, wait a second. Injustice everywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The most famous line, as I've said, from this letter. It looks good on a bumper sticker, right? But I don't know. Isn't that going a little far, right? I mean, at a daycare center, right? A bigger kid pushing a little kid down to take his cookie, right? It's unjust, right? It's somewhere, right? So that's an injustice somewhere. Is that a threat to justice everywhere? So maybe we can be skeptical, but inevitably there will be somebody in my class who will raise his or her hand and say, well, yeah, maybe. If the big kid then gets it in his head that, hey, nobody's going to do anything if I throw my weight around, and the little kid gets it in his head that nobody's going to do anything when I'm pushed down and my stuff is stolen, well, then maybe they grow up into adults who believe in injustice, right? So, yes, well done, whoever you are out there who would have raised your hand had we been in person, right, to say that. Because I think that's exactly what King has in mind here, right? We all have to live in this mixed community of people who are raised with these ideas and raised with these attitudes toward justice, these attitudes toward law enforcement, and if they are raised with bad ideas about what they can get away with and what other people can get away with regards to them, then we are being led to a nation of bullies and victims, right? Categories that then will switch sides whenever at a moment's notice, right? And that's chaos. So, yes. So, in the first case, King, in his letter, responds to the charge that these protests are being directed and led by outsiders, and that's a bad thing, right? Because it's none of your business, in effect, they're saying to Dr. King. And King's response is, well, in the first case, I was invited here by local leaders. And in the second case, injustice everywhere is a threat to injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And we are all caught in this inescapable tapestry of destiny, And we can't pretend that what one person does one place isn't going to directly or indirectly affect what happens somewhere else, right? Next, King responds to the idea that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely, that the wheels are turning, so to speak. Birmingham is getting better, and that everybody just needs to slow down and give the process some time to work itself out, right? Again, a very, very familiar idea in the modern era, right? When I started teaching this back in 2008, when I would talk about the letter from Birmingham jail, all of this was purely hypothetical, right? But within a few years, right, and the Brown shooting and the stuff since, these issues have been very present, right? So not at all hypothetical. Anyway, so to this idea that everybody just needs to slow down and give the process a second to go forward, and these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. King says, you're asking us to wait. We can't just wait. Wait means never. We've been waiting for centuries, for 340 years, he says, for the United States government to recognize the suffering of the black person, to recognize our basic fundamental human rights, to recognize our humanity, that we're human beings, right? And this is just a trick, right? The idea of wait only serves the status quo. It only serves the people who don't need to change. Freedoms are never voluntarily given up by the people who benefit from one group being discriminated against. You're asking the oppressor to just sort of wake up one day and be enlightened and say, oh, well, okay, fine, here. Take all of these advantages, these unfair advantages that I have, because I'm enlightened now. And King says that's just not the way it works, right? History doesn't work that way. It doesn't roll along towards this inevitable injustice, or towards inevitable justice. It doesn't roll along to make things better for everybody. He says that justice occurs. Justice comes out of injustice because there's a small group of people who are out there constantly agitating for more and more and better and better. And nobody wants to hear it. Nobody in the majority, anyway. Nobody among the privileged class wants to hear, we're not there yet. Everybody in the privileged class wants to say, okay, well, I'm glad that's over, and now we're finished with racism and injustice. No, we're not there, right? When one injustice ends, it's time to move on to the next injustice. It's not time to just sort of celebrate that we're all better now, right? So King's attitude is, well, I've just got bad news for the privileged class. There's more work to be done, and after we get this done, there's going to be more work after this to do, right? And the moment we take a second to pat ourselves on the back is a moment when we begin to backslide. So furthermore, King says that the idea of waiting is intolerable to the blacks in the South under segregation, because segregation creates an intolerable situation there in the South. It creates this situation of constant daily humiliations. On page 3 of the letter from the Birmingham jail, beginning with a paragraph, we have waited for more than 340 years. Eventually that transitions into a sentence that begins about a third of the way down that says, but when you have seen vicious mobs, right? This sentence goes on in some, if you edit this correctly, this will go on for a full page, right? this one sentence that just keeps going on and on and on, just describing all of the petty, in some ways petty, in some ways very, very serious, but all of the different kinds of ways that a black person is reminded, or black people are reminded their place in under segregation. I'd read the whole sentence for you, which the literary critic Stanley Fish speculates might be the greatest sentence ever written in English. But I'd cry and I'd make a fool out of myself. But anyway, by the end of that sentence, the point of that sentence, the sort of the rhetorical force of that sentence becomes apparent about halfway through it, right? You become overwhelmed and surrounded by this ugly alternate reality that you, if you're white, haven't really considered. And so by the end of it, the idea that you just suck it up is ridiculous, right? So, okay. So the letter from Birmingham jail to the question from the call for unity, the accusation that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. King's response gets a little complex here. He says, "Well, we can't just. You tell us to wait. We can't just wait." He says, in the first case, we've been waiting for centuries for civil rights. In the second case, freedom is seldom given by the oppressor. It needs to be taken. The oppressor needs to keep the people with the advantages need to keep being pressed and keep being pressed for justice. Keep being reminded and keep being reminded. And it's always going to seem irritating and painful and upsetting. But that is because we're not there yet. And the third reason we can't wait is because King says segregation creates an intolerable situation. There is this whole list, this cumulative list of daily humiliations suffered by the black people in the South. And I didn't mention this other one, but King says all of this adds up to promoting what he calls, using some language from the philosopher Martin Buber, this situation, segregation promotes an I-it relationship between blacks and whites. An I-it relationship is where you treat people not as fellow beings, but as objects to be discarded and moved around and rejected and deposited elsewhere, right? That is in contrast to what Buber calls an I-thou relationship. That is where you respond to people as though they are your fellow human beings, right? This should sound hopefully this sounds very familiar. This is very much the same thing that Immanuel Kant was talking about when he talks about using other people as mere means versus treating them as ends in themselves. If you're using them as a mere means, you are not treating them as a human being. You're just treating them as an object to do your bidding. On the other hand, when you treat them as an end in themselves, you're treating them as a fellow human being who also has maxims and ideas and goals to be respected and valued just as much as yours are, right? You don't take them as opponents, you take them as fellow human beings, right? And if you don't do that, if you have a society or an ideology that promotes the idea that other human beings are objects just to be moved around at your convenience, then what this does is this distorts the image of that we have with people. This creates a situation where we don't see people as fellow human beings. We don't value them. We just see them as problems. We just see them as drains on resources. We just see them as things to be sort of shunted off and forgotten about at our convenience, right? And this creates inevitably a false sense of superiority in the oppressor, in the majority, and a false sense of inferiority in the minority, right? And in this case, is creating a false sense of superiority in whites and a false sense of inferiority in blacks. And it hurts, King says, it hurts the souls of both whites and blacks in that way, because it is a lie. It is a vicious propagandist lie about both the white superiority and black inferiority. So, much like Longino said, pornography was a lie against women. Okay. Next, King wants to address an issue that's kind of in the background of the call for unity, but it's a very common idea expressed to him in the midst of all of this, and it's the idea that, hey, we might dislike segregation, and you might think that segregation is wrong, but it's still the law, and so you should still follow it. And if you don't think it's right, then you should call and write your congressman and agitate for the legal process to go through. But taking it to the streets, engaging in these practices to disrupt social order and to make life miserable, it is and breaking the law while you're doing it, especially, is a bad thing in and of itself, right? So let's see how he responds to that. So even if we disagree with segregation, it's still the law. Shouldn't we obey it? Well, to this, King says that, there are two kinds of laws. There are two kinds of laws that we have in our society, right? There are just laws, good laws, and there are unjust laws. What is the difference? He cites as a source here Saint Augustine, right? The Catholic saint who wrote extensively about these kinds of matters in the 5th century. But King, throughout the letter, makes extensive use of his knowledge of history and of philosophy and of literature. So the real tour de force. Anyway, there are two kinds of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. And King says, well, the difference is, in the first case, King is, he is the Reverend Martin Luther King. He is a Christian. So he is perfectly willing to, and he's addressing specifically he's addressing both directly and indirectly a Christian community, and so wants to bring those views to bear. And he says, well, just laws are in step with God's law. Unjust laws are out of step with God's law. Just laws, they represent what King calls sameness made legal, which is to say equality, that we treat everybody the same. Unjust laws, however, they target some people as having more rights and more freedoms than other people. They represent what King calls difference made legal, that there is a privileged class and then there is an unprivileged class. Furthermore, the unjust laws, they uplift human personality. They bring out the best in us. They exist to help us turn into better and better people. Unjust laws, on the other hand, as you might imagine, do the opposite. An unjust law that targets some people as inferior to one group, superior to another people, and one group inferior. He says it distorts human personality. It creates this false sense of superiority and false sense of inferiority, and it makes it harder for us to become the best possible version of ourselves. It makes it harder for us to, as individuals, to maximize our potential and to maximize the good in us. And it certainly makes it harder for society as a whole to become a better place to live, a more just place to live, right? So the notes on just laws versus unjust laws. Even if we disagree with segregation, it is the law, and breaking the law is bad, says the point. And King, in response, says, well, there are two kinds of laws. There are just laws, they are in step with God's law, and an unjust law that is out of step with God's law. Just laws are sameness made legal. They treat everybody the same. Unjust laws, they represent difference made legal. They target some people as inferior to others. And through doing that, just laws uplift human personality by making us recognize that we are all fundamentally equal and human beings. Unjust laws, however, distort human personality by making lying to people and telling some people they're better than others, right? And other people they're inferior to others, right? So what then is our responsibility with regard to just laws and unjust laws. Whoever pushes the idea that we may not like segregation, but we have to follow the law, is in effect saying that, well, we have a duty to follow the law even when it's wrong. And that's where King says, no, there are just laws and unjust laws, and we have different duties as citizens. We have different duties with regard to them. So King says that just as we have a duty as citizens and human beings to obey just laws, we also have a duty to disobey unjust laws. But we have to do this in the right way, he says. If you decide our drug laws in our country are bad or unjust, then you might say, well, I'm going to break that unjust law, and I'm going to sit around in my living room and get high, right? That's not what King has in mind, right? In that situation, you're flouting the law just because probably you want to get high, right? That's not what he's talking about. Now, what he's saying is that we have, if you decide that a law is unjust, you have a duty to break it in a way that is meant to call attention to the fact that it's unjust, and to call attention to the fact that people who suffer as a result of this law are suffering for no good reason. You are trying to arouse the conscience of the community. You are calling attention to the law, and you're doing it, King says, openly, lovingly, for the good purposes of trying to change the law. And maybe most importantly, you do it accepting willing to accept the consequences, which you know are going to be bad. That's one of the reasons the law is bad, right? So sitting around in your living room getting high is not what King has in mind. But if the drug laws are what you want to take on, then at a protest about drug laws, lighting up a joint or something like that out in public, where willing to be arrested and to call attention to how, hey, I'm getting arrested and beaten up now just because all I did was light this joint, right? If that would be the kind of thing that the King has in mind, right? So he's not going to be breaking the segregation laws in any sort of quiet way. Quite the opposite. He's going to be they're breaking them openly so everybody can see the results, right? So, with regard to just and unjust laws, King says, just as we have a duty to obey just laws, we have a duty to disobey unjust laws. And how do we break unjust laws? We do it, he says, lovingly, openly, to rouse the conscience of the community, and we have to be willing to accept the consequences, right? Okay, going back to the call for unity, there's a section in the call for unity where it says that extreme measures are not justified in Birmingham. That the implication being that King represents a kind of extremist, and that we all need to modulate how we're reacting here, right? And that if you're showing up at a protest for King, that is a vote for these extreme measures. Now, to this, King says, well, now wait a second. Let's look at the sort of political map here. If we look at all of the movements that are going on here in 1963, having to do with these sorts of issues, I actually don't represent the extreme measure, right? The most extreme measure would be the rising tide of black nationalism, right? Who are arming themselves, a lot of these black nationalists, and they are threatening and often sometimes engaging in violence against property and people to bring about a revolution where they say they're going to, all the black people need to go to their black nation, right? On the other hand, King says so that's one extreme. The other extreme would be blacks in the South under segregation who are suffering, but who have learned to play the game and have learned in some cases even to prosper under the rules of this game and just keep their heads down and do what they're told and say yes sir when a black or a white person addresses them, and they can under certain circumstances they can even thrive a little bit and raise a family and have a decent life within the rules of oppression, right? So King says those are the extremes. The complacent black people who are getting along under keeping their heads low and just getting along under segregation, and violent black nationalists. And King says, I represent a third option. I'm the middle option. I'm the middle path between these extremes. And by the way, if that middle path isn't there, then there's going to be no place for somebody who is under segregation. A black person under segregation is going to have no options besides either put up with it or pick up a gun and join the black nationalists, right? And so King says, maybe it's working in everybody's best interest that we have somebody willing to engage in these kinds of nonviolent protests as this kind of third middle option that is not trying to upset or tear down the American system, but just trying to make the American system consistent with its own fundamental values. On the second hand, King says, well, now, but if you insist, then call me an extremist, right? I guess I am outside of the mainstream, but I'm outside of the mainstream for love, for goodness, right? I'm an extremist for the good, right? And in the same way that people like St. Paul, who was killed for his views, Jesus also killed for his views, the original Martin Luther, and Thomas Jefferson, these, to name just a few. These were all people who in their own time were called extremists, right? And King says, well, if you want to put me on that list, then fine, right? So King says that to the claim, people in the Call for Unity say that extreme measures are not justified in Birmingham. King says, well, I am not the extremist. I am the middle path between, on the one hand, complacent Southern blacks who are going along to get along and keeping their eyes down and taking the oppression and learning to thrive, in some cases thrive into the oppression. And on the other hand, you have violent black nationalists who are who are openly calling for a violent black revolution, right? Furthermore, King says, if you insist that I am an extremist, then I am an extremist for the good. I'm an extremist for love in the tradition of St. Paul, Luther, Jefferson, and Jesus Christ. Okay, King finishes up by addressing two demographics in the white community that he thinks are giving him a kind of support that he really can't do anything with, right? They are pretending to support him in a lot of cases, but their support is half-hearted and he thinks kind of self-serving, right? So in the first case, he talks about the white moderate, right? These are white people who are not racist, or they're not overtly racist, right? In fact, they explicitly reject racism. They say racism is bad. They think that people who are burning crosses and beating up black people are bad. They are shocked and appalled when they see on the nightly news that these protests are going on and that Bull Connor and his thugs are stomping on people, on peaceful protesters' necks and spraying children down with fire hoses and all that sort of nonsense. And the white moderate is just, they're very upset. And they change the channel, do something else, right? And King says, that's the problem, right there. So you are, in a lot of cases, they don't just ignore it. They actually, and he has some of the people who are authors of the call to unity here in mind. He thinks, in fact, some of these people even condemn his tactics, right? They say, we want justice, we want racial equality, but, I don't know about, protests. I don't know about boycotts and upsetting people and going into southern communities and causing these big, ugly scenes, or bringing about these big, ugly scenes, right? To that, King says, well, the white moderate, they prefer peace to justice, right? And they're going to agree with his goals. They're going to at least pay lip service to the idea that yes, we want racial harmony and we want justice. But then they're going to criticize even his nonviolent tactics. It's one thing to criticize the tactics or the goals and tactics of a black separatist. It's another thing to criticize the tactics of somebody who's going into these communities and leading a peaceful protest, right? What these people don't understand, what the white moderate doesn't understand, King says, is that this unrest, this unpleasantness, is a necessary step between the status quo and justice, right? You don't get there otherwise. You don't just good intention your way out of an unjust situation into a just situation. There has to be a period of pain. There has to be a period of inconvenience. There has to be a period of people realizing that things are bad and maybe you're a hypocrite, right? And King compares this to a boil, right? We have boil. Maybe you're watching an episode of Dr. Pimple Popper MD. Some of my family members are big into that show. It's a reality show on one of those cable channels. Anyway, if you have a boil on your hand or on your arm, right, and it's gathering all of this really ugly pus, right? What do? Well, you can put a Band-Aid over it or a bandage over it, but you're going to get a bigger and bigger bandage, and eventually it's going to take up a bigger and bigger space, right? That's not the way to treat a boil. The way you treat a boil, go to a dermatologist. Don't try this at home. But you have to lance it. You have to take something and you have to cut it open. And then what happens? It's ugly. It's gross. It squirts pus and blood, and it causes children to faint. And it's very disgusting, right? But that's how we heal. That's how we get back to a better situation, is we have to put up with the disgusting lancing of the boil. And King says, this ugliness is the lancing of the boil. This unrest is the ooze spurting out of the boil. And yes, it's horrible, but it is a necessary step to health. Furthermore, and this is an appropriate place to end his letter, to bring it back around. He started out by addressing the authors for the call for unity, and he brings it on back home in the last couple of pages. He says, you know what else? I've got a real problem with the white church in this country. There's a lot of religious people in this country who, again, pretend to support my cause. But when it comes time to actually helping me, when it comes time to actually helping the cause in the ways that are going to further the goals of the cause, the white church has time and again kind of stepped back. And they stepped back back away from these social justice causes by time and again emphasizing, well, we're the church. We're not really about making the world better. We're about enlightenment. We're about salvation. We're not interested in this world. We're not interested in social justice here in this world. We're interested in salvation in heaven in the next world, right? King to this, he has sort of this funny sort of digression where he's, I visit these churches and I hear these things and I say, who are these Christians? I don't recognize this kind of Christianity, right? This is not the this is not my Christianity. This is not the Christianity of St. Paul or Jesus Christ. That say, well, hey, forget about how things are in this world and don't, obey the law and don't piss anybody off and we'll just go on to the next world. The Christianity, King says, that he knows is a Christianity that has been a force of social change and social justice since its inception, since it came into reality, right? And he says, presciently, I think, this is written in 1963, not that long ago, but back when the church, the average American went to church every Sunday, right? And the church and God were a very important part of every average American lives, not nearly as much as it is today. Very many people in our own modern society, when you ask them in a poll if they're Christian, they say yes. But when you ask them if they go to church every Sunday or how often they pray or so on, you get a very different answer than you would have back when King is writing this, right? And King says, again, I think very presciently, he says, churchgoers and church leaders who think that you can do this, that you can just pretend that religion and Christianity are not really about this world, but they're only about getting into heaven. More and more, going to church, being part of a Christian community, is just going to be, it's going to be like any other social club. It's going to be just a social club. It's going to be like joining an Elks Lodge, right? Where you just go and sit around, and it's just one way to meet people and drink beer or exchange recipes for macaroni and cheese, right? And the more that the church becomes just a force, that just a kind of a social club that people join and something that irritates them into getting up on Sunday morning, the more the church is not going to be part of the American life anymore, right? It's not going to be a relevant force in the American moral conscience. I think on that issue, King might be absolutely right about how that went. Look today. Look at the I think the most vocally critic people or vocally Christian people that we have in our modern U.S. society are the evangelicals, right? And the evangelicals will give you exactly this kind of argument whenever you ask them about, well, hey, you believe in justice, but you're not going out and joining the racial protests. Well, no. We're only about heaven. We're not really about like social justice, right? King is score a direct hit. Anyway. So that is the letter from Birmingham jail, right? What are the results? So what happened? Well, King won, unconditioned, right? Down goes Bull Connor, down goes segregation in the South. The following year, so first of all, just in the short term, I should say that the specific protests in Birmingham are an unqualified success, right? They do exactly what they're intended to do. They bring the city to its knees. Nobody within a few days, they can't even. They don't even have enough food to serve the people who are in the jails. Right? The jails are packed, and there's more people coming in. And there's more protesters filing in. Right? And so the city has no choice but to negotiate with King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they very, very begrudgingly agree to desegregate. The following year, thanks to the Civil Rights Act, that takes this decision out of local and state communities and just says, no, segregation laws, period, are not unconstitutional. They're going to be a violation of the law, right? So today, you can't just hang up a whites-only sign. Sorry, racists. You can't just hang up a whites-only sign at your business. That's a violation of the Civil Rights Act. Okay, so this is, and I like to end it here. Not just the lecture, but the course, because this is the answer to the question. When people ask me, what can you do studying with a philosophy major? What can you do studying all this philosophy? Well, I like to point to the letter from Birmingham jail, right? Which is one of the most important central documents of the civil rights era. And its force, its moral and rhetorical force, comes from largely King's ability to place himself, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, place himself within this historical struggle that's been going on for millennia. And now, right here today, it paints it as, this is the moral issue of our time, and whose side are you on? Are you on the side of justice, or are you on the side of the authors for the call for unity, who are going to do everything they can do to distort their faith, to keep the status quo, and to keep this this unseemly peace that they have going on, right? And so, what can you do with the philosophy major? You can change the world. So, okay. So, I almost forgot. The attendance password for today is cheese. My wife earlier was eating some cheese in front of me, and now I'm kind of hungry. Anyway, so, okay. So, thank you all. I will talk to you later.